You began to plant the seed in people's minds. But I think in the process, you did create a media image of me that's far beyond, the reality of me.
And this craving, this awful, raging, eating feeling inside. I could feel it consuming my insides. It was overwhelming me.
Hello again, and welcome to Serial Killing, a podcast. My name is Elissa Kerrill, and I am the researcher, the writer, producer, editor, host, all of the things. And this podcast is where I cover all things true crime, not just serial killers, and that's perfectly okay. If you are into the entire story of these dangerous people, including childhood experiences and possible genetically inherited issues, the nature versus nurture debate that we're all familiar with, right? Well, then you've come to the right place because that's what I do here. If you are anything like me, you just want to know the hows and the whys of true crime. And also, if you are into kind of murder and mayhem shenanigans with some stories of the animal uprising, check out my second podcast, Serial Killing, Murder in the News. We do a lot of dark humor, slapstick, silly stuff over there, but it is the news nonetheless. So this week's podcast will be a revisit of one I've covered, albeit years and years ago. There is another new show about this subject out, and it's not Ryan Murphy this time, but just in case whoever put this one together took a lot of creative liberties, I thought I would refresh our memories about the accurate story about John Wayne Gacy. Most of us are very familiar with Gacy, right? But as I've said many times, we must be mindful of the younger generations maturing into their new love of all things true crime who aren't familiar with the details or as familiar with them as we are. Plus, you guys are already familiar with my style, and you know that I'll bring you his entire childhood, his experiences, and everything that played an important role in Gacy becoming the serial killer he became. Now, I will say quickly that when I cover these more kind of well-known guys, I get a lot of comments about me making, excuses for these murderers, and let me be clear. I am not making any excuses here. I am just pointing out the reasons. Excuses and reasons, there is a difference. So without further ado, John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17th, 1942 in Chicago, Illinois. And though I won't dwell long, I promise, let's get into some of the things going on in the world around the time John's mother was pregnant with him, because the stress levels and various exposures affect pregnant women and their fetus as well. It is a small but still important piece to the overall puzzle. So in 1942, we saw a turning point in the ongoing World War II. The Holocaust escalated into a formal genocide plan. Soviet forces counterattacked and began to encircle the German army, trapping them within the city. The minimum age for men to be drafted into the military went from 21 to 18. The United States began air raid attacks on Japan. Car manufacturers switched to making war materials. The K-9 Corps began training dogs for use in war. The citizens in allied countries were asked to donate any scrap metals as they were desperately needed for the war effort. And that's pretty much nearly all that was in the news back then, just war, death, and destruction. But some other famous people born in 1942 are singer Aretha Franklin, Barbra Streisand, Paul McCartney from the Beatles, Jerry Garcia, and Jimi Hendrix. So a lot of musical talent in that lineup. His father, John Stanley Gacy, was born in June of 1900 in Chicago. Going back a bit, his parents, John's paternal grandparents, were Nicholas Gacy and Veronica Jablonski, and they had both been born in Poland. And in Poland, their names were pronounced a lot different, but that's neither here nor there. At some point, they both immigrated to the United States quite young, as 8 and 10-year-old children with their parents. Nicholas and Veronica met and married each other in January of 1893 in Chicago. Documents mentioned that Nicholas was a farmer. Again, our John's paternal grandfather, Nicholas, a farmer. They went on to have 8 children, which was very common back then, and especially so if there was a family farm to work. John Sr. was the second to last baby born to the new Americans. John Sr. was raised Polish Catholic, and he attended Mass at a church that had a very large Polish immigrant population or congregation. And when John Sr. was just 5 years old, Nicholas passed away, he himself being only 35 years old. I didn't immediately find out what from, but regardless, this would have been quite the traumatic event at John Sr.'s young age. But then again, sources say that he had a good support system. He attended school, he was proficient at reading and writing, and at 17 years old, John Sr. enlisted and joined the Army in 1917, though at this point, the war would be over by the next year. Now, there are some kind of arguments back and forth about John Sr.'s birth year, but obviously he would have lied about his birth year in order to enlist when he was only 17. So that is why there's a discrepancy. But during his time fighting, John Sr., it was said that he developed pretty serious PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Once the war was over and he left the military, he moved back in with his mother and remaining siblings still living at home. By 1920, John Sr. was working as an assembler at a steam gauge company, and he found his talent. It was said that he could really fix anything, and he went on to specialize and become a machinist in a factory in Chicago. So now let's talk about John Wayne Gacy's mother. Marion Elaine Robison was born in Racine, Wisconsin in May of 1908. Her father was Albert Robinson, who had hailed from Michigan, born in 1860. Her mother went by the name Etta, born in 1865 in New York. So Marion's family had been in the United States for a few generations, and she had been the youngest child out of 5 children. Now, I didn't really find much about her childhood, but I certainly found nothing indicating that she had been abused or neglected in any way. There was literally nothing that stood out. She just had a normal childhood and she grew up. So, 39-year-old John Sr. met and married 30-year-old Marion in 1939 in Chicago. Seems like an advanced age, but those are the numbers. Marion, as an adult, was described as intelligent, outspoken, and having a more sunny disposition. She loved to sing and dance and spend time with her friends, which was the utter opposite to John's general kind of darker and more dull character. She had worked as a pharmacist prior to their marriage, so she was highly educated, and she was described as a generally good person. But once she married, she stayed home, she didn't work, and they began to create their family. So their first child was a daughter born in 1939. John Wayne Gacy was again born on March 17, 1942, 3 years later. Then their last child, a daughter, was born in 1944. Our John was the middle child, sandwiched between 2 sisters. He was born with a congenital heart defect, and right off the bat, he needed a little more tender care. So, as it turned out, John Sr. was a severe alcoholic, likely a symptom caused by his very serious PTSD. John Sr. would go down into the basement after work and he would drink brandy. Marion and the children would then listen to him begin to talk to himself, which would eventually escalate to him shouting in anger. Then once he was good and soused, right, he would stomp upstairs and act out in a rage towards his family. And thus, young John would watch, from as far back as he could remember, his father physically and verbally abuse his mother, including knocking out her teeth. Yeah. And when it came to his son, John Sr.'s preferred weapon of choice was either a belt, a leather strap, or a razor strap, which is a very thick and kind of tough strip of leather that back then they used to sharpen facial razors. I'm sure you've seen it in movies and cartoons. John's first memory of his father abusing him was when he was, quote, playing house with a girl from the neighborhood. His father beat him when he caught them. Another time, John was messing around with some car parts as his father was working on a car. So, John Sr. saw that young John had gotten some of the parts moved around and out of order that his father had taken them apart in, so he beat his son severely. Both of these incidences, by the way, occurred before that child was 5 years old. The physical and emotional abuse inflicted by his father continued throughout his entire childhood, most often after no real provocation or even cause. His father beat him in the head with a broomstick once, and that knocked him unconscious. And I think we all agree that a head injury that causes a child to become unconscious is serious. And he was not sent for any medical attention for this either. Now, even though Marion was also often the target of these attacks, she did her best to try to protect John from these beatings. But as any of us can imagine, her efforts were almost always unsuccessful. So at 5 years old, John began to have seizures. It was then that he was finally taken to the doctor, where he was then prescribed very strong anti seizure medications. Then, not long after this, it was time for him to begin elementary school. But due to his heart condition, he was not allowed to do much of any level of physical activity, such as playing and running during recess or participating in PE classes. That's what we over here in the States call physical education classes. And because he was unable to get any real exercise, well, he became notably overweight, and predictably, the other kids bullied him because of it. Of course, his father would belittle him and say that he was, quote, faking it with regards to his heart issue. John Sr. never let his son hear the end of it about what a sissy boy he was. Young John's teachers would go on to say that he was actually a good student who seemed to always be willing to help others, and in fact, his teachers were rather fond of him. He even assisted the school truancy officer, which was kind of school staff that kept up with children who were absent from school. Now, you can imagine that that did not make him a popular kid with the other students either. John was also trusted to run errands for not only teachers, but his own neighbors as well. This tells us that he became a people pleaser, always going out of his way to attempt to win the praise and approval from the adults around him. He would, of course, try his entire childhood to impress and win his father's favor, the same that he could any other adult. But nothing ever worked. John felt that his father hated him and he deserved the punishments, no matter the severity. Now, there is something to be said about having two sisters and being the only boy. I mean, sisters love to have their brothers join them in their kind of girly games, including playing with dolls or having tea parties. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with brothers playing the girly things with their sisters, because the opposite happens and no one bats an eye, right? I don't care what side of what fence you stand on for whatever reason. But if his father caught him participating in any activities that his sisters were taking part in back then, obviously it wasn't as tolerated, then his father would berate him and again call him a sissy. It's not like he could go outside and run and catch a football. So, one place John would go to be able to get some needed, much needed respite from his father was a play area beneath the family's porch. For whatever reason, his father tended to leave him be if he were under there and out of sight. A bit foreshadowing? What do you think? So, at 6 years old, John wanted a toy truck from a store and he decided to steal it. He was 6. Okay. Once his mother discovered what he had done, she walked him back to the store and made him admit what he had done and give the truck back, apologizing to the owner. Now, it should have ended there, but unfortunately, this is one of those rare, very rare cases where his mother told his father what had happened, and his father beat him severely with a belt. And at the tender age of 7, John later stated that he was sexually molested by a friend of his family's. This quote, friend was a contractor, right, who offered to take John with him to construction job sites or perhaps just go for a ride. I mean, you can imagine John's excitement, the attention, the kindness. But these rides turned into John being fondled or having him perform sexual acts on that man. Now, I want you to absorb this. Except John didn't dare tell his father what was happening because he was afraid his father would say it was his fault, and that usually ended with physical violence. At such an incredibly young age, this kid was 7, John had decided that being sexually groomed and assaulted was preferable to his father's anger. At that same age, John Sr. found a pair of his wife's underwear in young John's sandbox that he did enjoy playing in, a little more quiet play, easier on the heart. Enraged, his father confronted him about it and beat him severely, saying he was a sissy and a, quote, mama's boy who would probably grow up to be queer, end quote. Not my word. Family later stated that John Sr. was just angry because he knew his son, his namesake, would never be eligible to join the military as he had, and felt that his son was an embarrassment and a failure, and he never hesitated to let John know about it. Once in his childhood, John was hit in the head hard with a swing that actually caused a blood clot to form in his brain, which went undiagnosed until he was 16 years old. And as the beatings continued, John would continue to have seizures. Clearly, these are believed to have been caused by the multiple instances of head trauma that he had endured. Unfortunately, young John wet the bed well into his later childhood years, and that also did not go unpunished. One of John's sisters would later state that they learned to toughen up during the beatings, and John was actually able to condition himself to not cry. Now, you'd think that John would have taken his frustration and anger out on animals, as many serial killers typically predictably do, but no, not John. He's the anomaly in that aspect. He was actually an animal lover, and he adored the family pets, caring for them and spending a lot of time with them. This was his softer kind of side that he got from his mother. And then Marion also fostered a love of gardening in her son, which he did continue on into his adult years. At 14 years old, after he had had to have his tonsils removed, John began experiencing intense stomach pains, but his father stated he was just making it up. And so John's appendix ruptured and he had to be hospitalized. He nearly lost his life. For the next 4 years, John would be in and out of the hospital due to his blackouts, seizures, and other injuries, which affected his grades greatly, and he began failing school, though his IQ was later tested and it was pretty high. So at some point during puberty, John began to realize that he was gay, but he did not dare to even insinuate that that was the case because he knew his father would beat him within an inch of his life or worse. So he kept it to himself. He stuffed it deep down and did his best to live as if being gay would be the last thing that he would ever consider. So he would make himself go out on dates with girls. On one particular date where he was going to attempt to be intimate with a girl, bless, it was said that he blacked out for over 10 minutes. Doctors later believed this happened due to anxiety. But John had missed too much school due to him being in and out of the hospital, along with trying to cope with his life and his own mental health issues, and so he dropped out. His father just used this as further ammunition to tell John that he was never going to amount to anything. And despite all of this, John still desperately tried to please his father, though his father said he was, quote, stupid and never good enough. And so that was John's childhood. There's really just so much here. We need to first jump in at the very beginning. The glaringly obvious issue is the physical and mental abuse John, as well as his sisters and his mother, endured from his father. We all know that abuse of any kind leads to all manner of issues, both in the immediate and in the long term. The physical effects of abuse are, of course, immediate injury, such as the head trauma that John endured. It can also lead to things like high blood pressure, anxiety, depression, functional limitations, brain damage, chronic illness, chronic fatigue syndrome, withdrawal from friends and society. I mean, the list is nearly endless. It is interesting to note that within the child's brain, endured child abuse can also affect certain regions of the brain and thus the brain failing to form as it normally would. Abuse has a direct correlation with a reduced volume in the size of the brain overall or specific regions. These regions include the amygdala, which processes emotions. I mean, if you've been listening to me for any amount of time, you already know. Screw ups in the amygdala, oh hell no. Then the hippocampus could also be affected, which is pivotal in learning and absorbing information for later recall. Then we have the orbitofrontal cortex, which is responsible for reinforcement-based decision making and emotion regulation. This area is another region that a lot of serial killers have some form of deficiency. And then finally, the corpus callosum, which is what helps the left and the right side of the brain communicate with each other and process things like arousal, emotion, and the higher cognitive abilities. Now, I will go ahead and tell you that John's brain was actually preserved after his execution and was studied, but visually, only visually, there were no obvious signs of malformation. But again, it was a general observation. There wasn't any really careful analysis that I have found. Regardless, child abuse affects the developing brain as well as the person's physical well-being in the long run, and they can go on to perpetuate the cycle of abuse in their adulthood. There's so much more with child abuse, but let's just move on to the seizures. The seizures are caused by a sudden surge of electrical activity in the brain and affects how a person behaves or acts for a short period of time. Some shake uncontrollably. That's what we see in the media. Some completely collapse and others just sort of stare off into space. The person experiencing the seizure often either experiences a loss of consciousness or at least a change in their consciousness. Most only last a few minutes and don't pose any threat to the person experiencing them. Seizures are usually due to other medical issues like a really high fever, a serious infection, head trauma, which John endured, accidental poisoning or drug overdose, or even a brain tumor. And sometimes there just is no explanation. There are medications that can help people who have seizures, but they are not a cure. They just help control. What medication is prescribed is based on factors like what type of seizures they're having, how old the person is, if they have other medical problems, and so on. Side effects of these medications are feeling sleepy, developing a rash, mood changes, irritability, stomach problems. Remember, he was having really bad stomach aches. But they can also affect the liver, kidneys, blood cells, bone growth, and can cause dizziness, nausea, headache, vomiting, fatigue, blurred vision. I mean, these meds are no joke. We also know that John was bullied by his peers. Children who are bullied might display differing behaviors, but in the short term, their grades suffer, as John's did. Then there's the social isolation, sleep disturbance, changing of eating habits, low self-esteem, school avoidance, anxiety, which John had, bedwetting later than normal, which John did, higher risk of illness, stomach aches, which he had, headaches, symptoms of depression, on and on. And let's not forget, John wasn't just bullied by kids at school because his father was his ultimate bully. John also experienced head trauma that resulted in a blood clot. There are a few symptoms that are associated with this, but an important one is that it can cause seizures and overall weakness. And let's not forget that John was sexually abused and molested by one of his father's friends at a young age. Children, depending on the age, but generally overall, who experience sexual abuse are too young to know how to express what has happened and to seek out help. They can't process it, they can't understand it. And if it isn't addressed, it can lead to PTSD, depression, and anxiety. And in some cases, the child grows up to then reenact that traumatic event, as in, John went on to become a contractor and lured boys to go with him. the violence he inflicted on the young lads compared to what his father did. I mean, do you see the correlations? Children who are sexually abused can also become secretive or show unusual aggressiveness, avoidance in anything to do with sex related topics, withdrawal, distrust, forcing sexual acts on other children, and so on. And then finally, he was just simply attracted to other boys. In this day and age, no one bats an eye, thank God. But back then, health professionals and the public at large thought of it as a mental illness. It was actually listed as such by the American Psychiatric Association in the DSM book until 1974. People back then either felt forced to go to counseling or were sent to a behavior modification facility for, quote, conversion therapy, or they just simply hid it, forced into living a lie for fear of the social stigma and, quite frankly, fear for their lives, depending on where they lived. So, with the severe physical abuse, the emotional abuse, the repeat head traumas, blood clot on his brain, the seizures, the illnesses, remember his appendix, his heart, being bullied, and being gay during a time where it was nearly unacceptable, how was John going to grow up to be what most would consider normal or average? So, let's get back into it. When John Wayne Gacy was 18 years old, he decided he wanted to get involved in politics with the Democratic Party, much to the disappointment of his father. But in a surprising twist, his father bought him a car, to which John was responsible for making the monthly payments for. John was excited, but it was a double-edged sword because this also enabled John Sr. to take his keys from his son whenever he felt like it, not allowing John to drive the car. Of course, we understand that it was just another tactic for John Sr. to control and belittle his son. And so young John made the decision, now that he felt he was grown, that it was time to leave. He packed up what he could and he moved from Illinois down to Las Vegas, Nevada. Just to give you an idea of how far away Chicago is from Las Vegas, if you were to drive straight through without stopping to sleep, it would be a minimum of a 25-hour long drive. So John got a job in a mortuary as a mortuary assistant, and when his shift was over, he slept on a cot in the facility behind the embalming room. John later stated that he saw a teenage boy in a coffin and decided to climb in, where he caressed and lovingly held the corpse, but then, quote, snapped out of it, and he began to feel very anxious and kind of disgusted with himself, and he kind of clambered out of that coffin. It wasn't long after this that he called his mother and asked if he could move back home. So after returning to Chicago, he entered a business school and graduated in 1963 when he was 21 years old. He then took a manager trainee position for a shoe company, and he actually did so well in this role that he was transferred to Springfield, Illinois to work as a salesman, then quickly worked his way up to manager. No one would question his work ethic. He also began dating a young woman named Marilyn Myers, who was one of his coworkers. In March of the next year, they became engaged, and they married in September of 1964. Soon after, Marilyn's father bought some Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants in Waterloo, Iowa, so the newlywed Gacys moved there so John could manage the stores. During this time, John also became a local civic leader of the JCs and devoted much of his free time with this endeavor. The JCs are really the kind of United States Junior Chamber of Commerce, and it provides opportunities for young men to develop personal and leadership skills through service to others. So this makes sense, right? If he felt he could never please his father or make him proud, then he would go above and beyond to win the favor of his community. So this was also when John would have his first real sexual experience with another man, grown. He later said that another man in the JCs got him drunk, got him to go to his house where he was near passing out on the man's couch, and the man performed oral sex on him. By 1965, John had risen through the ranks of the JCs to become the vice president of the area, and he was named the third most outstanding JC in the state of Illinois. The next year, his father-in-law, quite impressed with his young son-in-law, that he made John the manager of all three KFC restaurants that, his father-in-law owned. His yearly salary was set at $15,000, which, doing the conversion, is nearly $120,000 per year today. He also earned a share of the overall profits earned from the restaurants. And since the stores were in Waterloo, Iowa, well, obviously John and his wife would move there from Illinois. And once they settled in Waterloo, life was going pretty well for them. He was making excellent money, he was considered a pillar of the community, and not long after, he became a father. Michael was born in 1966 and Christine followed in 1967. And much to John's surprise, he had also finally won his father's approval. During a visit from his parents to Iowa, John Sr. apologized to his son, stating he had been wrong about him. Now, can you imagine that moment for John? I mean, he must have been nearly overcome. And make no mistake, John threw himself into his career as well as the JCs, often working 12 to 14-hour days, and then on top of that, headed several fundraising projects. At meetings for various organizations, he would provide free fried chicken from his stores and wanted to be nicknamed the Colonel. But behind the scenes, John was living it up in more scandalous ways. People he associated with participated in wife swapping, so he talked his wife into that lifestyle for a short bit, but he also cheated on his wife with several prostitutes on several occasions. He also began befriending his young employees and inviting teens to play pool in his basement, where he plied them with alcohol and began making sexual advances at the boys. If they refused, then he would, pass it off as a joke. But just months after his daughter was born, 25-year-old John Gacy sexually assaulted his first victim. The son of a friend, he lured the 15-year-old boy to his house with the promise of seeing pornography. Creepy. John then gave the boy alcohol and talked the youth into performing oral sex on him. And there were several more boys after that. So John was basically reenacting what had happened to him in his youth. Gacy talked another teen boy into sleeping with his own wife, then used that as leverage to get the boy to do the same as the others. John even tricked some into thinking he was conducting scientific experiments into homosexuality. He would then pay them $50 each for oral sex. Finally, in 1968, after he had gotten away with these behaviors for about a year, Gacy's friend's son finally told his father about what John had made him do. The father called the police, and Gacy was later charged with oral sodomy of 2 teens. Gacy completely denied any wrongdoing, even demanding a polygraph, which clearly showed deception. John tried to say that the accusation was politically motivated, that one of the fathers of one of his victims had opposed John's nomination to be the president of the Iowa JCs. And many people actually believed him, and they supported him. John even talked one of his employees into assaulting one of his victims to try to keep him from testifying. And the youths did fight, but the victim was able to get away and called the police immediately. It came out that John had offered to pay the youth $300 to beat the victim up. So John was ordered to have a psychiatric evaluation at the State University of Iowa. Now, 2 doctors evaluated him for nearly 3 weeks, and both diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder and therefore would most likely not benefit from any therapy or treatment, and that he would be a repeat offender in the future. And boy, how correct they were. But they also said he was mentally competent to stand trial. So, John's attorney convinced him to plead guilty to only one of the counts of sodomy, and therefore he was convicted in December 1968 and was given a 10-year sentence. The day that he was convicted, his wife filed for divorce, and which one of us would blame her? But he actually never saw her or his children again. During his stint in prison, he quickly earned the reputation of being a model prisoner. It didn't take long for him to work his way up to being the head cook. Now, interestingly, there was an inmate chapter of the JCs that he joined, and he was able to get the membership up to 650 from only 50, which was actually rather impressive. He also worked to improve living conditions for the inmates. He was even able to finish school while there and earned his high school diploma. Then in 1969, on Christmas Day, John's 70-year-old father succumbed to his alcoholism and he died from cirrhosis of the liver. John was not notified until his father had been dead for 2 days. Once he heard the news, it was said that he became inconsolable. He did request supervised compassionate leave to be able to go to his father's funeral, and he was denied. Now, if we think about it, John would have known that his father went to his grave completely ashamed of his son for being in prison as a sexual offender, a sexual predator. There would be no earning his father's respect ever again. But then 6 months later, in June of 1970, he was put out on parole on the condition that he would move back to Chicago and live with his mother. He would also have a very strict 10 p.m. curfew, and he also had to check in with the Iowa Parole Board frequently. Once he got moved back, he quickly got a job as a short order cook. So, not even a year later, John was arrested for luring a teen into his car that he picked up from the Greyhound bus station with the promise of driving him home, but then sexually assaulted him. Unfortunately, the teen didn't show up to court, so the charges were dropped. And because he was now in Illinois, the Iowa Parole Board didn't find out about it. Legal information crossing state lines like they do now was just not a super common thing back then. So once this new incident was behind him, his mother helped him buy a house, the house, on Summerdale Avenue. And at first, John and his mother both lived in the house together. But not too long after, he reunited with an old high school girlfriend who was now divorced with 2 small daughters, and they began dating. Once they were married in July of 1972, his mother moved out. But a few months before his wedding, John drove by the Greyhound bus terminal again, and on this occasion, he picked up 16-year-old Timothy McCoy. He took the teen on a sightseeing tour of Chicago, then drove him to his house and told him he could spend the night and he'd drive him back to the station in time to catch the bus. John Gacy awoke the next morning to find McCoy standing in his bedroom doorway with a kitchen knife in his hand. This is according to Gacy. John said he leapt from his bed and Timothy raised both arms in a gesture of surrender, tilting the knife upwards and accidentally cutting John's forearm, and he did have a scar. John then twisted the knife from the teen, grabbed the youth, wrestled him to the floor, then stabbed him repeatedly in the chest as he straddled him with his own body. Now, John later claimed he went to his kitchen and saw an opened carton of eggs and a slab of unsliced bacon on his kitchen table. McCoy also had set the table for two. He had walked into Gacy's room to wake him while absent-mindedly carrying the kitchen knife in his hand. There was no ill intent. John buried Timothy's body in his crawl space under his house and later covered the youth's grave with a layer of concrete. This would be his first murder victim. John was at this point 30 years old. So, in an interview after his final arrest, Gacy stated that immediately after killing Timothy, he felt exhausted, but had also experienced a, quote, mind-numbing orgasm as he had killed the youth. And he added, quote, "That's when I realized that death was the ultimate thrill." So 1 week before his nuptials to the new girl, another teen filed a complaint against him, stating John had pretended to be a police officer, including a sheriff's badge and all, and had lured him to his car and forced him to perform oral sex on John. Luckily for John, the charges were subsequently dropped when the teen was caught blackmailing John, trying to get him to pay him to drop the charges. As his new family got settled, he quit his job as a cook and started his own construction company, which he named PDM's Contractors. It's PDM standing for Painting, Decorating, and Maintenance. John offered services for minor repairs, concrete, interior design, installation, room remodeling, and landscaping. And this business was extremely successful. Once, John took a young employee of his to Florida to look at some property that he had purchased. While there, he raped that young man. And then after, the youth refused to stay in the room, choosing instead to sleep on the beach. And once they returned to Chicago, the young man went to John's house and proceeded to beat his ass. When his wife asked why, John stated that he had decided against paying the young man due to a poor work performance. But yet again, John's public persona was elite, fantastic, on point. On paper, he still looked like a pillar of the community. He attended church, he was a family man again, and volunteered as the Democratic precinct captain in his area. During this time, he threw elaborate block parties and built a solid reputation within his local community. I mean, he was respected and admired by friends, neighbors, the local police. In 1974, John murdered his second victim. The still unidentified teen youth had medium brown, curly hair between 14 and 18 years old, whom John strangled before storing the youth's body in his closet prior to burying him. Gacy later stated that fluid leaked out of this youth's mouth and nose as he was stored in the closet, staining his carpet. Because of this, John began stuffing cloth rags or the victim's own underwear in their mouths to prevent a recurrence of said leakage onto his carpet. This particular unidentified victim was buried about 15 feet or 4.6 meters from the barbecue pit in John's backyard. But in 1975, well, this was a pivotal year for John. By now, he had created his famous alter ego, Pogo the Clown, and then another one, Patches the Clown. He designed the costumes and even taught himself how to apply clown makeup. He performed as Pogo or Patches at numerous local parties, Democratic Party functions, charitable events, and even children's hospitals. He even dressed in his clown costume to go to a favorite drinking venue of his named the Good Luck Lounge on several occasions, with the explanation that he had just performed as Pogo and was stopping for a social drink before heading home, even though he had just put it on to go to the bar. But his marriage was not doing so well, and after he and his wife had sex on Mother's Day of that year, he informed her that that would be the last time. He told her he was bisexual, though it is reported he was homosexual, just forced himself to be with women. His wife later stated that she had noticed John bringing teen boys into his garage and had also found gay pornography inside their house. They mutually divorced in March of 1976. John later admitted that this was also the year he began to increase his sexual excursions, if you will, with young males. He referred to this as cruising. One of these teens was 15-year-old Anthony Antonucci, who John had hired to work for his company. In July, Gacy arrived at Anthony's home, and while he was alone, due to injuring his foot at work the day before, he gave that kid alcohol, he wrestled him to the floor, he cuffed his hands behind his back. But the cuff on Anthony's right wrist was loose, and he freed his arm after John left the room. When he returned, Anthony, a member of his high school wrestling team, jumped him. The teen wrestled John to the floor, he got the handcuff key and cuffed Gacy's hands behind his back. John screamed threats, but then calmed and promised to leave if he removed the handcuffs. The youth agreed, and John left the house. 1 week later, another employee of John's, 17-year-old John Bukovich, disappeared. The day before, the young man had threatened Gacy about him owing him 2 weeks back pay. John lured him to his home to issue the overdue wages. John somehow conned the young man into allowing his wrists to be cuffed behind his back. Gacy then strangled him and buried the body under the concrete floor of his garage. Gacy later admitted he, quote, sat on the kid's chest for a while before killing him. Bukovich's car was found in a parking lot, the boy's wallet inside, and the keys still in the ignition. The boy's father called John, who said he'd be happy to help search for the teen, but was sorry that the kid had, quote, run away. John was eventually questioned about this young man's disappearance, and he admitted that the teen and two friends had come demanding the overdue pay, but that all of them had left after a compromise had been reached. Interestingly, over the next 3 years, that young man's parents called police more than 100 times, begging them to investigate John further. And once John got a taste, right, he began killing in ever increasing intervals. This is very typical. He killed a 17-year-old teen named Michael Bonin by strangling him with a ligature and buried him in the crawl space. 10 days later, 16-year-old William Kerrill was murdered and buried directly beneath John's kitchen. William was the first of 4 males known to have been murdered between June 13th and August 6th of 1976, and who were buried in a common grave under Gacy's kitchen and laundry room floor, so like a mass grave. There was one unidentified male that was murdered between those dates who was a bit older than the others at between 22 to 30 years old, and I would say closer to 22 if we're looking at John's preferences. Now, he was buried directly beneath the body of 16-year-old James Hakinson, who is last known to have phoned his family on August 5th and whose body was itself buried directly beneath that of 17-year-old Rick Johnston, who was last seen alive on August 6th. So we're talking almost day after day. John hired 18-year-old David Krim and invited him to move into his house. One day, John conned David into putting on handcuffs while David was drunk. He then informed him that he was going to rape him. David, who had been in the army, kicked John in the face, then freed himself from the handcuffs and escaped. Shortly after David had fled John's residence, another employee of PDM Contractors, 18-year-old Michael Rossi, moved in. And really, at this point, John was quite literally kind of piling the corpses on top of each other under his house. So in March of 1978, John realized he had run out of places to bury the ever-increasing number of bodies on his property. So he began dumping them over the I-55 bridge into the river. John lured another victim, Jeffrey Rignall, into his car. Once he was in the car, the young man was chloroformed, right, and then driven to John's house, where he was raped, tortured with various instruments, including lit candles and whips, and repeatedly chloroformed until unconscious. Jeffrey was then taken to Lincoln Park, where he was dumped, unconscious but alive. He managed to get to his girlfriend's apartment. Jeffrey was later informed the chloroform had permanently damaged his liver. Police were again informed of the assault and again did not investigate John. Jeffrey was able to recall John's distinctive black Oldsmobile, the Kennedy Expressway, and particular side streets. Jeffrey staked out on the exit on the expressway where he knew he had been driven until he saw John's black Oldsmobile. Then he and his friends followed John to his house. Police finally issued an arrest warrant, and John was arrested on July 15th. He made bail and was facing trial for the battery charge against Jeffrey when John committed his final murder on December 11th, 1978. He visited a pharmacy to discuss a potential remodeling deal with the owner of the store, Phil Torf. 15-year-old employee Robert Peast heard John mention that he hired teenage boys at $5 per hour, almost double the pay that Peast earned at the pharmacy. So after Gacy left the store, Peast told his mother that, quote, some contractor wants to talk to me about a job. He left the store, promising to return shortly. Only when he didn't, his family filed a missing person report to the police. The owner of the pharmacy named John as the contractor. And they questioned John, and he completely denied talking to Peast, indicating that he had seen two youths working at the pharmacy, and that he had asked one of them whether any remodeling materials were in the back of the store. He was adamant, however, that he had not offered this kid a job and promised to come to the station later that evening to make a statement, saying he was unable to at that moment as his uncle had just died. That's what he told them. So at 3:20 a.m., John, covered in mud apparently, arrived at the police station claiming he had been involved in a car accident. Police were then convinced that John was behind Peace's disappearance and checked his record, discovering that he had an outstanding battery charge as well as serving a prison term in Iowa for the sodomy of a teen boy. A search warrant for John's house was ordered by a judge at the request of detectives and turned up several suspicious items, such as a 1975 high school class ring, various driver's licenses, handcuffs, a 2x4 with holes drilled in the ends. And who does that sound like, sidebar? Dean Corll out of Houston, and there are some theories that those two were part of the same network. But that's not for this podcast. Okay. So there were books on homosexuality, books on pedophilia, a syringe, male clothing, obviously too small for John because he was chubby, bless, a 6mm pistol, and a photo receipt from the pharmacy where Robert Peast worked. Police decided to confiscate John's car, along with other PDM vehicles, and assigned surveillance teams to follow John while they continued their investigation. So 4 days after his last murder, investigators were able to link evidence obtained from John's house to missing young men, and John knew he was being watched by surveillance detectives. So he started inviting them to join him for meals in various restaurants and occasionally for drinks in bars or his own home. He repeatedly denied that he had anything to do with any disappearances and accused the officers of harassing him because of his political connections. Knowing these officers were unlikely to arrest him on anything trivial, he openly taunted them by breaking traffic laws and succeeded in losing his pursuers on more than one occasion. While he was doing this, the police brought in a dog to sniff the inside of his black Oldsmobile that had been brought in for examination, and the dog hit on the passenger seat of the car for Peast's scent, meaning his body had been in that car. That same evening, John invited two of the surveillance detectives to a restaurant where, over breakfast, he talked of his business, his marriages, and his activities as a registered clown. Gacy even told them, quote, clowns can get away with murder. Gacy was starting to show visible signs of stress due to the constant surveillance. He was unkempt, tired, appeared anxious, and was drinking heavily. The next day, John drove to his lawyer's office to prepare a $750,000 civil suit against the police, demanding that they cease their surveillance. But that night, one of John's employees was interviewed and informed detectives that in the summer of 1977, John had him spread 10 bags of lime in the crawl space of his house. On December 19th, 8 days after murdering Peast, John invited two of the surveillance detectives inside his house. One officer distracted him with conversation, while another walked into the bathroom and flushed the toilet, noting a smell he suspected could be that of rotten flesh coming from a heating duct. Gacy's former employee, Rossi, was interviewed by investigators on December 20th. When asked, Rossi stated bodies might be in the crawl space. He stated he dug trenches in the crawl space and said Gacy insisted that he not deviate from where he was instructed to dig. The next evening, Gacy drove to his lawyer's office and appeared disheveled, immediately asking for an alcoholic drink. Then they asked Gacy what he had to discuss with them. Well, he picked up a copy of the Daily Herald from a desk, pointed to a front page article covering the disappearance of Robert Peast, and informed his lawyers, "This boy is dead. He's in the river." Now, worried that John might be suicidal, the police decided to go ahead and arrest him. Ultimately, he was charged with 33 murders. He tried to convince people that he had dissociative identity disorder, which was back then called multiple personality disorder, which I've covered. He was instead diagnosed as a psychopath. No one bought it, and he was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to death. John Wayne Gacy tried desperately to appeal his conviction, naming all manner of reasons why he was not guilty. But he was executed on May 9th, 1994. His final words were, quote, "Kiss my ass." And so that is the whole story. Now, I do believe that he would be considered a sociopath, not a psychopath, if I were forced to give him that specific label. His father suffered from serious PTSD, but that wasn't something John Sr. was born with. I believe our John was born with the genetic propensity to be a decent human. And look at his mom. And I believe it was ultimately his environment, the mental and physical abuse he endured as a child, that sort of molded him into the serial killer that he became. But I also want to add the caveat that many children experience serious mental and physical abuse and grow up never wanting to hurt a single soul. So, do you think the added bonus might have been his head traumas? Maybe. But I would love to know what you think. So leave me a comment, or you can DM me on Instagram at serial_killing. You can also come join the Facebook fan page created by the BFF. And all of the links to all of that are below in the show notes. But most importantly, guys, thank you so much for listening, because I know you could be listening to anyone else, but you chose me, and I really appreciate that. Thank you so much, guys. Have a great day.
Anybody who killed more than 2 or 3 people was a mass murderer, and whether it was all at one place or over an extended period of time. And then in the early 80s, they came up with this differentiation called serial killing.